The story of Westborough State Hospital has been intertwined between good intent, first strides, and misunderstanding. For me as an urban explorer, first having explored these grounds in 2015, Westborough has always been a place of intrigue, pondering who and what came before. Around the campus, you find many different types of architecture, some ranging from the 1800s to modern day, all in various levels of decay. Some sections had been abandoned since the 1970s. Some had remained in use until the hospital's closure in 2010. I first went to Westborough in 2015. After that, I made various trips to the hospital. The campus was over 600 acres and contained 61 buildings. It was pretty much impossible to see the entire place in one day, but this always led for excuses to go back various times and to try and find new areas. And there was always some mystery, not knowing exactly what the entire place looked like and wondering what the different areas were used for and who the people who were there might have been or what their story was. The area I'm walking through right now was the women's infirmary. Westborough was primarily a psychiatric hospital. However, it didn't start off that way. In 1848, it opened as the Massachusetts State Reform School. This was actually the first state-operated reform school in the country. It housed boys up to age 16. Eventually, the institution was renamed after Boston Mayor Theodore Lyman. The institution wanted to reform young offenders rather than to send them to prisons.
No, I'm getting out of it.
At its peak, the school could house up to 500 inmates. The boys slept in a cell block. During the day, they would work, farming and maintaining gardens around the campus. By 1884, the institution had been considered inadequate and closed. A new reform school was opened under the same name across the lake.
Pretty cool place though, huh?
The existing campus was to be converted into an insane asylum.
Stairs going down.
The cell block was demolished.
What?
Some of the outlying
2
buildings
seconds.
were demolished, and others were renovated. In December of 1886, the Westborough Insane Hospital would open. "204 patients were transferred from other institutions deemed to be overcrowded, such as Worcester, Northampton, Taunton, and Danvers. These patients were considered to be chronic, requiring long-term care. Westborough would attempt to be a first in a new type of care. It opened as the second homeopathic hospital in the country, and the only one in Massachusetts at the time. Homeopathy sought to treat the patients humanely. Natural remedies, such as fresh air and good food, were preferred over what was called hypnotics, or synthetic medications such as opium or morphine. Physical restraint was also attempted to be minimized as much as possible. On a side note, the area I'm walking through now was the Robert F. Kennedy Children's Action Corps, which was a residential treatment facility for juvenile offenders.
Wow, someone smashed that thing.
Homeopathy was started in 1796 by physician Samuel Christian Hahnemann. Throughout the 18th century, a common treatment for many illnesses was bloodletting or various cocktails of different herbs or certain things that were dangerous to the body, but at the time, people didn't really know any better. However, Hahnemann was not satisfied with this and thought that there could be a better way to treat people. Hahnemann was one of the first people to treat the mentally ill humanely. He believed that mental illness was no different than physical illness, and he also believed that to cure that, it would be a physical cure. Westborough's first superintendent was Dr. Nathaniel Payne. He originally had served as the assistant physician at the State Homeopathic Asylum for the Insane in Middletown, New York. Payne went to measures to ensure that homeopathy would be practiced at Westborough. The hospital quickly filled. Overcrowding led to a need for expansion. Most of the buildings at Westborough were connected by underground tunnels. I'm currently walking through the tunnel that leads from the Kennedy building to the cafeteria. The tunnel was used for utilities, but also could be used to shuffle patients.
Oh, this one. Look at that, it's more water.
Upon emerging from the tunnel, one finds themselves in the dining hall. The conjugate dining hall could house up to 200 patients. The hospital was mostly self-sufficient, growing, producing, and cooking all of its own food. Having been grown and cooked with pride by the patients, the food was considered to be quite good. Westborough had many outlying buildings. One of the things that made it a lot of fun was the diversity in the architecture. You could go from the old areas, which were built in the 1800s and abandoned in the 1970s, but then you could find yourself in the Daniel and Hennessy building. Here I am walking through one of the connectors. These were more modern, having been opened in 1967. They closed in 2010 when the hospital closed.
Yeah.
On my first trip to Westborough in 2015, I first accidentally stumbled into these buildings, so they've always been kind of a special building for me. When I first explored them, they were in very good condition, but at this point, in 2017, they were not really in good shape anymore, having fallen prey to vandalism. Originally opened as the geriatric wards. Towards the end of Westborough, you could find patients on these wards that have lived their entire lives at the hospital. Also in the same buildings was an adolescent unit. Back in the nurses' station, I found this cabinet full of supplies. They aren't too old. You can imagine a nurse coming back here, trying to find what they needed. These buildings contained the only psychiatric inpatient unit for deaf and hard-hearing patients in New England. The unit was revolutionary at meeting the needs of its patients, and many of the staff were deaf themselves. Neil Glickman describes his experience as co-director of the unit in his article, Lessons Learned from 23 Years of a Deaf Psychiatric Inpatient Unit. I will now read directly from this article in order to give an idea of what it may have been like there. Ed was a 30-year-old man transferred to the deaf unit from a hearing hospital where he had been brought by the police in restraints after threatening his parents. He grew up in a third-world country where he received no formal education. He had never been exposed to sign language and used only home signs with family. Initially, he appeared to lack the concept of language. When first admitted, he didn't attend when people signed and made no effort to learn sign. He was a large man and would gesture dramatically, vocalize loudly, and raise his fists. His parents managed him by giving him whatever he wanted. Joe was a 16-year-old student in a nearby deaf residential program. At the time of his hospitalization in the deaf unit, the police arrested him and brought him to the emergency room after he threatened a teacher with a knife and threw rocks at her car. The reason he gave was that he was mad because the teacher had postponed a trip to the mall. This room has always interested me. It has some type of a carpet amongst the walls. There's two of these rooms next to each other. I'm not exactly sure what they were used for or what their purpose is. In the middle of the buildings, you could find a completely enclosed courtyard with a basketball court. This area contained some type of padded walls throughout the entire ward. Back behind the nurses' station, you can still find remains of some of the old things from the hospital. Leaving the Daniel and Hennessy building and returning to some of the older areas, we now find ourselves inside the Childs building. Childs was open in an attempt to alleviate overcrowding. It housed acute female patients and had a focus on individual therapy. Mental illness has historically and throughout today been stigmatized and misunderstood. Oftentimes, patients will be disowned by their family, left alone at the hospital with no one to visit them. Such a case was described in the article Abused, Isolated, and Controlled: The Suffering of Mental Health Patients by Lawrence D'Angelo. The article talks about a patient, not her real name, but called Linda, who had spent much of her life at Westborough. It reads, Linda died alone that morning. Her last thought was about her small jewelry box, a gift from her mom and dad she carried with her for 40 years as she shuffled around Westborough State Hospital. Her parents had promised to visit her, but after dropping her off at the hospital, when she was 20 years old, they never returned. No one prayed at her bedside or at her gravesite. No friends or families came to pay their last respects. With quiet efficiency, Linda was moved from the hospital and placed in an unmarked grave in the northeast corner of Pine Grove Cemetery, 106 South Street, Westborough, Massachusetts. A small cement cylinder marked her grave with the number 433. Quickly, grass covered the numbers, and Linda was forgotten. Sadly, Linda's story was not unique, nor was it unique to Westborough. Throughout psychiatric hospitals at the time, due to a lack of understanding of mental illness, it was common for families to just leave people at hospitals without caring for them anymore. Throughout its tenure, over 500 patients would pass away at Westborough. I'm currently now inside of the administration building. Westborough was a workplace to some historically significant psychiatrists. Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller is considered to be the first African American psychiatrist in the United States. He also made significant findings in the research of Alzheimer's disease. It was at Westborough, in the beginning of the 1900s, that he established the work of his mentor, Alois Alzheimer, that dementia was caused not by a mental disorder, but a physical one. Further into the administration building, one finds a mural painted in 1952 by patient Scott Benson Williams. It depicts his journey through mental illness. Next to the administration building was the hospital's chapel. Here, patients could watch movies or listen to a band which consisted of both staff members and patients. Looking out of the window, one sees Allen Hall. Allen Hall is still in use to this day as a DYS facility for juvenile offenders. Originally, it was opened as Payne Hall, which was a dorm for female nurses. The nurses worked hard. An 1887 annual report states they were only given one afternoon and one night off a week. If they were caught flirting with male attendants, they could be and were fired. In the late 1800s, you would find nurses wearing white aprons with white caps. The male attendants would wear blue flannel suits. Westborough had a training school for nurses. The program would last 1 year and would teach the nurses how to work with mentally ill patients. The first year, in 1889, the program would have 9 women and 3 men graduate. As I explore around, I try to imagine what it must have been like there in the past. Reading stories and hearing accounts is one thing, but you can never truly appreciate what it must have been like unless you were there. A lot of the stories from this institution have been buried with time. For example, in this room, I really don't know exactly who was there or what their stories were. It's hard to imagine looking at it now as an empty room. Walking around the hospital abandoned, it's hard to imagine that in the 1940s, the census peaked at over 2,000 patients. I wonder who was on this stretcher and what it was like for them here. Off to the side of this larger room are smaller rooms, which appear to be seclusion rooms. Despite Westborough's commitment to following the homeopathic model of using as little restraint as possible, it was found by the Board of Lunacy that Westborough, quote, used excessive use of restraint and violence. Walking around the empty building, it's hard to imagine that the Board of Lunacy described their visit as noisy and confusing. The women's infirmary was visited twice a day by a physician. I try to imagine it as it once was, furnished with different decorations and plants to try to give it a more homely feel. Conditions on the women's ward were described as intolerable. At one point, drug addicts and alcoholics were mixed in with mentally ill patients. Part of the treatment model at Westborough was called the rest cure. It was believed that patients getting a good night's sleep, milk, and good food in abundance would help to cure patients. If a patient were to become violent or restless, they would be wrapped in towels until they were considered calm. The hospital was originally lit using gas light fixtures. Upon becoming fully electrified, the hospital began using machines that used electrical waves along with massage to treat depression and insomnia. Another therapy experimented with at Westborough was the induction of fevers to try to reduce psychotic symptoms in patients. It was falsely thought that because a fever was the body's way of fighting infection, that it might do the same to alleviate psychosis.
Yeah, be careful. Yeah. Careful over here again. See? Careful, baby.
Electroshock therapy and lobotomy was used on the most chronic patients. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, is still used to this day. It puts the patients into a seizure by passing an electrical current through the brain. While today it is only used as a last resort, there was a point when it was considered to be overused. And back in the day, they didn't use anesthetics. A lobotomy was a type of neurosurgical procedure which involved putting a metal rod under the patient's eye into the prefrontal cortex, severing connections in an attempt to flatten the affect of the patient. This was used in an effort to try and cure violent patients. In reality, it just caused brain damage.
Don't go over there, dude.
This area was the for-pay section. Here, patients could pay for their treatment in exchange for slightly better accommodations. Occupational therapy was another treatment used at Westborough. It was believed that by providing purposeful work and activity to patients, this would enhance their recovery. Patients could be assigned various jobs, such as sewing, furniture shop, canning vegetables, working the farm, or repairing things around the campus. It wasn't all work at Westborough. Taking the tunnel from the main building, you would find yourself in the Lang Auditorium. Opened in October of 1931, the auditorium could seat 1,000 people. The lower level was used for recreation and as a serving room. There was a canteen for selling snacks and drinks. Graduation ceremonies were held for the nursing school here. Employee dances and socials were held. Patient talent shows, as well as performances from community theaters and traveling magic shows. The hospital's orchestra would perform here. Can you imagine all of the patients assembled here to to watch a movie. Located across from the theater was the Talbot building. Opened in 1898 for the acutely insane, the building would cost $50,000 to build. The original purpose of the building was to separate the newly admitted patients from the patients that had been there for a while. Ornate plaster reliefs could be found on each fireplace. This building was originally equipped with hydrotherapy suites. Hydrotherapy, which inspired the modern-day jacuzzi, was a type of therapy that involved putting the patients in a warm bath. This was used in an attempt to calm the patients.
Oh, no. Yeah, no, but
There was once a volleyball court on this front lawn for patients to use. Each common room located at either end of the building once contained billiards tables for the patients to use. Later on, Talbot would be used for Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. In order to return to the main building, you would have to crawl through a crawl tunnel. We now find ourselves in the overflow ward, which suffered from a fire sometime in the 1960s. It was then blocked off from the rest of the hospital and left to decay. I can't help but to imagine that these coat hangers would be a ligature risk in a modern-day psychiatric hospital.
announced that another building was, yeah, full. What building is this? It is, but it's from the other side of the thing that's, this is the male side, we were on the female side originally. You know how in the middle it's separated by that collapsed floor? Yeah. We're on the other side of that.
This is the female side?
This is the male side. We were already on the female.
We now find ourselves in Codman Hall, opened in 1899 for acute male cases. It was in this building that Dr. Perry Baird had spent much of his admission. Dr. Baird, who was a prominent Boston physician, suffered from episodes of manic depression, which led him to be hospitalized at Westborough. While there, he wrote down much of his experiences in a memoir. His daughter, Mimi Baird, compiled his memoirs into a book entitled He Wanted the Moon. Dr. Baird's experience there was not a pleasant one, as he recounts his experiences being restrained in straitjackets and general misunderstanding and mistreatment of patients. I will now play an excerpt from a talk given by Mimi Baird with quotes from the book.
Now this is what the medical record says about my father's condition when he arrived that day. About an hour or two after admission, this patient became destructive, took his bed, which he managed to bend, and proceeded to knock the plaster off the windowsill, which he succeeded in doing. It was necessary to place him in restraint. It was impossible to reason with him or even converse. It really does take 4 attendants to place this patient in a wet packed sheet. Here is a sort of a selection of a few things he wrote while he was in this hospital. During these days of constant anguish, I was never allowed any food except while in restraint. If one did not open his mouth and swallow what was offered quickly enough, the stuff would usually be emptied into the mouth, partly around the mouth, and it would run in disgusting little rivers down the cheek, onto the neck, finding its way into the pack or jacket.
In April of 2010, the hospital would close its doors for the final time, ending a legacy of over 120 years. The remaining patients would be placed in community-based settings or transferred to the newly opened Worcester Recovery Center. When it closed, some of the patients had been there for over 28 years. Upon closing, Westborough would gain a new life, being appreciated and explored by urban explorers from around the world. For me, it has always been a special and favorite location. It's one of the first places I ever explored. For most local explorers, this place has always been considered their favorite, mine included. As of today, unfortunately, all of the buildings have been demolished. In their place, a housing development has been built. Despite these buildings being gone, it's important that we remember and learn from the legacy of the past of Westborough State Hospital.